What if the blood-soaked battlefields of the Middle Ages hid secrets far stranger than swinging swords and raising shields? Picture this. Knights didn't just rely on brute strength. They waged wars with whispers, using fear as a weapon long before the first arrow flew. Medieval warfare wasn't just a chaotic brawl. It was a chess match of deception where armies used everything from burning pigs to hollowed-out corpses to outwit their enemies. And here's the truth: most of what you've seen in movies, it's only half the story. Today, we're uncovering 30 shocking facts that'll rewrite everything you thought you knew about medieval combat. From bizarre weapons that defied the laws of physics to psychological tricks that could topple kingdoms without a single blow, this is the untold side of history where the real battles were fought with cunning as much as steel. Ready to step beyond the myths, let's dive into the shadows of the past, where every fact is more unbelievable than the last. One of the most bizarre tactics in medieval warfare involved turning animals into living weapons. Imagine the terror of facing a herd of panicked pigs, their bodies soaked in tar and set ablaze, stampeding straight toward your army's front lines. This wasn't some twisted fantasy, it actually happened. Commanders would deliberately exploit animals' natural instincts, using them as expendable tools of chaos. Bees were hurled in hives to unleash swarms against charging cavalry, causing horses to buck and throw riders into disarray. Even falcons weren't spared. Trained birds of prey would drop flaming materials onto wooden fortifications, turning them into kindling. These strategies reveal a chilling truth: medieval warfare wasn't just about strength or honor. It was a ruthless game where no tactic was too cruel if it meant breaking the enemy's will. And while Hollywood loves to romanticize knights in shining armor, the reality was far darker. A world where even the most innocent creatures became instruments of terror. When we think of siege towers, our minds jump to those massive wooden fortresses clunking toward castle walls, but the truth is far more clever. Many medieval armies actually preferred smaller, faster structures, some no bigger than a farmer's cart. Why waste time building an intimidating monstrosity when a simple, mobile platform could do the job just as well? Some commanders even disguised their siege towers as supply wagons, rolling them toward enemy defenses under the pretense of delivering goods. Imagine the shock when what seemed like harmless provisions suddenly unfolded into a hidden staircase, disgorging armored soldiers onto the battlements. This wasn't just about saving timber, it was about exploiting the element of surprise. While Hollywood loves spectacle, real medieval warfare often rewarded subtlety. A modest tower could be assembled quickly, moved silently under cover of darkness, or even dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere to confuse defenders. The lesson here: in sieges, brains frequently outmatched brawn. A well-timed trick with a humble structure could collapse an enemy's defenses faster than any towering war machine. History often credits weapons and tactics for medieval victories, but sometimes the real deciding factor came straight from the sky. Picture the mud-churned fields of Agincourt, where French knights in gleaming armor found themselves sinking helplessly into the mire, their horses thrashing against the weight of waterlogged earth. That single storm transformed what should have been a cavalry charge into a slaughter, as English archers picked off immobilized targets with terrifying ease. Weather didn't just inconvenience armies, it rewrote battle plans on the fly. A sudden downpour could render crossbows useless when damp strings lost tension, while summer droughts forced besiegers to abandon camps when wells ran dry. Even the wind held power, shifting smoke from burning villages into allies' faces or carrying the stench of unburied corpses to weaken morale. Commanders knew this deadly wild card well. Some timed campaigns around harvest seasons to ensure dry roads for supply wagons, while others prayed for winter freezes to harden marshlands into viable attack routes. The lesson: in medieval warfare, the greatest strategist wasn't always the general. It was Mother Nature herself, turning a sunny morning into a death sentence by noon. The medieval battlefield wasn't just about steel meeting flesh. Sometimes the deadliest weapons were invisible. Archers didn't just rely on brute force to bring down enemies, they turned nature itself into a silent killer. Picture this: an arrowhead dipped in the putrid juices of a week-old carcass or coated with extracts from deadly nightshade. A single scratch from such a projectile could spell agony as the wound swelled with infection, turning a minor injury into a death sentence. But the horror didn't stop there. During sieges, armies catapulted plague-ridden corpses over castle walls, unleashing invisible killers far more destructive than any battering ram. The defenders might have withstood hunger and thirst, but how could they fight an enemy they couldn't see, one that festered in their water supply and clung to the air they breathed? These weren't acts of desperation but calculated strategies, demonstrating a ruthless understanding of psychological and biological warfare centuries before modern science gave it a name. While knights jousted for honor on tournament fields, real war often played out in shadows, where victory went to those willing to weaponize decay itself. The lesson: in medieval combat, survival sometimes meant thinking like a healer. In reverse, the romantic image of noble knights engaging in honorable duels is one of history's most persistent myths because the battlefield was anything but fair. While tournaments preached chivalry, real warfare rewarded ruthlessness. Knights, often the most heavily armored and expensive soldiers on the field, rarely wasted their energy on evenly matched opponents. Instead, they sought out vulnerable targets: archers without melee weapons, supply trains guarded by peasants, or even fleeing infantry. The logic was brutal but practical. Why risk death in a dramatic sword fight when you could cripple an army by slaughtering its cooks and scribes? And when knights did capture high-value enemies, the so-called code of honor crumbled fast. Prisoners who couldn't pay ransoms were frequently executed on the spot, their bodies stripped of armor worth a commoner's lifetime wages. Looting wasn't just a side effect of war, it was the incentive. Entire campaigns were financed by the promise of plunder, with towns sacked not for strategy but for profit. The truth: chivalry was a propaganda tool, polished in peacetime and discarded the moment blood hit the dirt. The real medieval battlefield had more in common with a bandit raid than a knightly romance where survival meant exploiting every weakness and honor was just another word for a paycheck. Battlefields of the Middle Ages weren't always the male-dominated arenas history books suggest. Behind the clatter of swords and the shouts of charging men, some of the most formidable warriors wore dresses when they weren't in armor. Take Sicilgata of Salerno, a Lombard princess who didn't just inspire troops from a safe distance. She rode into combat wearing full plate, rallying broken lines with a sword in hand. Then there's Joan of Arc, whose name everyone knows, but few realize she wasn't some divine figure waving a banner. She was a tactician who outmaneuvered seasoned commanders, directing artillery placements and leading assaults that turned the tide of war. But these weren't the only ones. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War mention women slipping into armor under cover of darkness, their identities hidden until wounds or death revealed them. Some even rose through the ranks, like the mysterious Chevalier de Yon, who likely inspired later legends of female knights. What's truly shocking: many of these women weren't anomalies just erased by scribes who preferred tales of brave lords over battle-hardened noblewomen. Their existence cracks open the myth that medieval warfare was a man's world. In truth, where there was power to seize or homes to defend, women didn't just watch, they fought, bled, and sometimes rewrote history itself. Forget the idea of knights fighting solely for king and country. Some of medieval warfare's most decisive players answered only to the highest bidder. Mercenary companies like the infamous Catalan Company weren't just hired swords. They were sprawling enterprises with their own accountants, lawyers, and even diplomats. These were soldiers who treated war like a seasonal trade, negotiating contracts that included hazard pay, loot percentages, and guaranteed retreat routes if battles turned sour. One Italian city-state famously paid mercenaries not to fight during harvest season because losing farmers to battlefield deaths would starve the population come winter. The Swiss, masters of the pike formation, turned mercenary work into a national export. Their soldiers were so in demand that popes and kings competed to hire them years in advance. But loyalty had its price. The same Catalan company that served Byzantium one year would sack its cities the next when back pay went missing. This cutthroat marketplace reveals an uncomfortable truth. Many medieval battles weren't clashes of ideals, but corporate takeovers in iron and blood. Wars could drag on for decades not because of noble causes, but because professional armies had every incentive to keep the paychecks flowing. While nobles waved banners of honor, the real architects of victory often wore no heraldry, just a shrewd eye for profit and a contract tucked under their armor. Some of history's most decisive medieval victories weren't won with brute force, but with pure theater. Imagine standing on a castle wall as distant thunder grows louder, only to realize it's not a storm at all. Drums beaten by an advancing army, their rhythm synchronized to mimic an approaching tsunami of soldiers. The Mongols took deception further, dragging branches behind their horses to churn up dust clouds, transforming a modest cavalry unit into what looked like an unstoppable horde. But the mind games didn't stop there. Commanders would stage elaborate fake retreats, luring overconfident enemies into killing zones where hidden archers waited. One chronicle describes a besieged castle where defenders played carnival music day and night, not for celebration, but to drown out the sound of miners tunneling beneath the walls. Even religion became a weapon. Armies would march under stolen enemy banners, confusing defenders long enough to breach gates. These weren't just clever tricks, they were calculated strikes against morale, proving that breaking an opponent's will could be faster than breaking their lines. The lesson: in medieval warfare, the best generals understood psychology as deeply as swordplay. A well-timed illusion could collapse an army's resolve long before the first arrow ever flew. That gleaming plate armor you see in museums wasn't just heavy, it was a slow-burning oven strapped to a knight's body. Imagine wearing a metal suit weighing as much as a full-grown Saint Bernard, with the midday sun turning every inch of steel into a searing hot plate. Knights didn't just battle enemies, they waged war against their own gear, where heatstroke felled more warriors than sword strokes in summer campaigns. Records from the Crusades describe men collapsing in their armor like overcooked lobsters, their bodies found not with heroic wounds but with the telltale signs of fatal overheating, faces cherry red, limbs locked in rigor from dehydration. And water, the very thing that could save them, became a death trap. A knight stumbling into a shallow stream might as well have stepped into quicksand, his armor dragging him under with the merciless weight of an anvil. Some suits even had specialized hooks for rescue, not to pull them from enemy spears, but to fish them out of rivers like sunken treasure. The cruel irony. That iconic clanking sound in movies, dead silence, was the real goal. Knights stuffed their joints with cloth to muffle noise, knowing stealth could mean the difference between a surprise charge and a heat-exhausted collapse before reaching the front lines. Behind the myth of invincible warriors stood a far humbler truth. Survival often depended not on skill, but on who could endure their own armor the longest. The open waters of the medieval world held horrors no land-bound soldier could imagine. While castles and cavalry dominate history books, naval warfare unleashed a special kind of brutality where the sea itself became an accomplice to destruction. Take Greek fire, a sticky, napalm-like liquid that clung to ships and skin alike, burning even on water's surface. Byzantine crews pumped this nightmare fuel through pressurized tubes, creating flamethrowers that could turn an enemy fleet into a floating inferno in minutes. But the terror didn't stop there. Grappling hooks transformed naval combat into a macabre dance, with sailors yanking ships together so close that boarding parties could smell their enemy's breath before cutting them down. And then there were the hellburners, ships packed not with soldiers, but with enough gunpowder to vanish entire harbors in one apocalyptic blast. The Venetians used these early suicide bombs against the Ottomans, sacrificing a single vessel to wipe out docks, warehouses, and hundreds of men in a flash of fire and splinters. What made sea warfare uniquely sinister was the lack of retreat. On land, a routed army might scatter to the hills, but trapped between flaming decks and shark-infested waters, sailors faced a grim calculus: burn, drown, or surrender to pirates who prized captives as slaves rather than ransom. This was warfare stripped of chivalry's pretense, where innovation meant finding ever more efficient ways to turn the Mediterranean's sparkling blue into a graveyard. Faith wasn't just a comfort on medieval battlefields, it was a weapon sharper than any sword. Armies marched under banners stitched with sacred symbols, their swords anointed by priests who promised heavenly favor to those who fought in God's name. Knights would clutch fragments of saints' bones sewn into their gauntlets, while entire regiments advanced behind reliquaries holding strands of hair from the Virgin Mary or splinters from the True Cross. But this fervor came at a terrifying cost. At Nicopolis in 1396, French crusaders charged headlong into Ottoman lines without scouts or strategy, convinced angels would part enemy ranks before them. What followed wasn't divine intervention but slaughter, thousands cut down by disciplined Turkish archers who hadn't received the memo about Christian invincibility. The irony: many so-called holy relics were outright fakes, hawked by enterprising monks who knew desperate soldiers would pay a year's wages for a piece of St. George's shield that was really just old donkey bone. Yet even skepticism couldn't dilute religion's grip on warfare. Before Agincourt, English longbowmen stuck sword-shaped pilgrimage badges into the mud as taunts, daring French knights to attack the heretics who'd prayed at shrines their enemies hadn't. This wasn't just superstition. It was psychological warfare where the battle for heaven's favor became as vital as the one for earthly victory. When faith trumped reason, the results could be catastrophic, but when harnessed carefully, it turned frightened peasants into men who'd walk unflinching into volleys of arrows, truly believing death was just a doorway to paradise. The real killer in medieval warfare wasn't always the enemy's blade. It was the empty stomach gnawing at soldiers from within. While history books glorified charges and sieges, the silent collapse of supply lines decided more campaigns than any heroic last stand. Take the Crusaders marching toward Jerusalem. By the time they reached Antioch, their horses had been eaten, their belts tightened to the last notch, and their desperation so great that chroniclers whisper of corpses being stripped not just for armor but for grimmer purposes. But this wasn't just a crisis of the desperate, it was a structural flaw built into medieval warfare itself. A single knight's warhorse consumed as much grain as 20 peasants in a day, and an army of 10,000 could clear entire regions of food like locusts within weeks. The math was brutal. Forage parties venturing too far risked ambush, while staying put meant watching your strength drain away with each passing hour. Some commanders got creative, like Edward III, who timed his chevauchés to coincide with harvests, letting freshly reaped enemy fields feed his troops. Others weren't so lucky. Richard the Lionheart's march from Acre saw his men dropping not from Saracen arrows, but from spoiled meat and dysentery-tainted water. The lesson etched into these tragedies was clear. Courage meant nothing if bread wagons didn't arrive on schedule. Behind every legendary victory stood an unsung hero, the Quartermaster who somehow kept an army from eating itself alive. Medieval arsenals held more twisted creativity than a nightmare's workshop. Take the humble flail. What began as a farmer's tool for threshing grain morphed into a terror weapon, its spiked iron balls swinging on a chain to shatter bones through armor gaps. But the innovation didn't stop there. Morning stars turned wooden handles into deadly art, studded with protruding spikes that could puncture a helmet like parchment. Then came the gunpowder shields, bizarre hybrids of defense and destruction, wooden bucklers rigged with small cannons that let knights fire point blank while blocking blows. But perhaps the most ingenious were the weapons born from desperation. Peasants, forbidden from owning swords, reaped a grim harvest with war scythes, blades yanked straight from their fields and bent upward to slash at charging cavalry. These weren't just tools of war, they were symbols of rebellion, proof that even the oppressed could forge lethality from the ordinary. The lesson: medieval battlefields weren't uniform showrooms of chivalric steel, but chaotic laboratories where necessity birthed horrors no blacksmith's manual could predict. While nobles swung polished broadswords, the real masters of adaptation were often the conscripts, turning pitchforks into pikes and sickles into skull crackers, proving that in war, sometimes the most terrifying weapons were the ones never designed for fighting at all. The battlefield surgeon's tent was where hope went to die as often as it was saved. Picture a table slick with blood, where the most common remedy was a saw, not for cutting wood but limbs. Without antiseptics or anesthesia, medieval medicine was a brutal lottery. A soldier surviving a sword strike might later perish from a healer's well-intended but filthy hands, as wound dressings were often reused rags soaked in dubious concoctions of wine and herbs. Some surgeons swore by maggot therapy, letting insects clean festering wounds, a rare practice that actually worked, though no one understood why. Others relied on mummy powder, ground up ancient corpses falsely believed to stop bleeding, which more likely introduced new infections. The real tragedy: many treatments were based on ancient texts like Galen's, written centuries earlier and riddled with errors, like the belief that pus was a sign of healing rather than disaster. Even arrow removal became a deadly art. Practitioners would use goose quills to probe wounds, often shattering bone or nicking arteries in the process. The few who survived faced a new nightmare: phantom pain, where amputees swore they could still feel their missing limbs burning or itching. In an era where a simple splinter could spell doom, the greatest enemy wasn't the opposing army, it was the very people tasked with keeping soldiers alive. The true reaper of medieval battlefields wielded neither sword nor arrow. It was disease creeping through camps like an invisible scythe. Armies marching off to glorious war rarely considered the deadliest threat wouldn't come from enemy lines, but from their own fetid living conditions. Picture a siege camp after weeks of stagnation. Latrine trenches overflowing into drinking water, men packed shoulder to shoulder in mud-choked tents, their bodies weakened by hunger and stress. Dysentery didn't discriminate between knight and foot soldier. It turned brave warriors into gaunt specters, their strength draining away with each bloody stool. Typhus, spread by lice thriving in unwashed gambesons, could wipe out entire regiments faster than any cavalry charge. The 100 Years' War delivered a chilling statistic. For every soldier who fell in combat, 3 more succumbed to fever or flux, their names lost to history while battle dead got songs and tombs. Even victory carried a bitter cost. Conquering armies often abandoned freshly taken castles not due to counterattacks, but because the stench of piled corpses made strongholds uninhabitable. Some commanders resorted to desperate measures, like the English at Harfleur, who burned their own infected dead in mass pyres rather than let disease spread. The cruelest irony, many battlefield triumphs were actually won by the side whose camp happened to be upwind when the wind carried plague across no man's land. While poets sang of heroic last stands, the real war was a quiet, relentless grind where the difference between life and death might come down to who boiled their water or changed their socks. Behind every medieval battle line moved shadow spies who could turn the tide of war without drawing a single sword. While kings and generals took credit for victories, the real architects of triumph were often nameless scouts slipping through enemy camps, counting cooking fires to estimate troop numbers or bribing servants for gossip about supply shortages. These weren't just lone wanderers, they operated in networks, passing coded messages through harmless-looking merchants or pilgrims. One surviving English spy's report from the 100 Years' War reads like a medieval spreadsheet, meticulously detailing French grain stores, bridge conditions, even the morale of local peasants. But the deception ran deeper. Commanders would plant deserters loaded with false troop movements, knowing their frightened demeanor made them believable. A single well-placed lie, like whispers of a non-existent mountain pass or a fabricated noble betrayal, could send entire armies marching in the wrong direction for weeks. The Venetians elevated this to an art form, maintaining a permanent intelligence bureau that cross-referenced reports from diplomats, sailors, and even courtesans. Their most brilliant trick, deliberately letting their cipher books be stolen, only for enemies to waste months decoding meaningless gibberish while real secrets traveled via innocuous laundry lists. This shadow war had no gleaming armor or heroic charges, just the quiet certainty that knowledge and the right lie at the right time could topple kingdoms faster than any siege engine. The so-called Dark Ages were anything but dark when it came to engineering ingenuity. Medieval minds built machines that would make modern physicists nod in respect. Take the trebuchet, not just a simple catapult but a precision instrument of destruction. These giants could hurl 300-pound stones with terrifying accuracy, some models even featuring adjustable counterweights to fine-tune distance like a deadly dial. But the innovation didn't stop there. By the 14th century, European smiths were crafting Ribbldequins clusters of small cannons mounted on wheeled carriages, essentially the medieval equivalent of a machine gun. And let's shatter another myth. Leonardo da Vinci didn't spring from nowhere with his war inventions. He stood on the shoulders of forgotten masters like Conrad Kaiser, whose 15th century manuscript, Bellefortes, sketched out everything from paddle-wheel warships to armored tanks centuries before they became battlefield realities. The real surprise, some of these designs worked shockingly well. During the siege of Constantinople, the Byzantines deployed Greek fire through pressurized bronze tubes, a flamethrower so effective its exact formula remains a mystery today. This wasn't primitive guesswork, it was applied physics where engineers calculated trajectory, tension, and combustion with tools we'd recognize as early scientific instruments. The lesson buried in these blueprints is clear. The medieval world wasn't waiting for the Renaissance to innovate. It was already reinventing warfare, one brilliant contraption at a time. Siege warfare wasn't just about breaking down walls. It was about breaking human spirits through calculated cruelty. When attackers surrounded a city, they weren't simply waiting for hunger to do its work. They orchestrated psychological nightmares. Imagine the terror of hearing a whistling sound overhead, only to see the decaying carcass of a horse flung into your town square by a trebuchet, its putrid stench carrying disease through cramped streets. Some commanders took horror further, catapulting live prisoners, screaming allies whose voices would haunt defenders from within their own walls. These weren't acts of random brutality but carefully crafted terror campaigns designed to turn neighbor against neighbor as desperation grew. The infamous siege of Kaffa saw Mongol forces hurling plague victims over Genos defenses, unwittingly birthing history's first documented case of biological warfare. Yet the true tragedy lay in the grim choices faced by those trapped inside. Starvation reduced parents to unthinkable sacrifices, while surrender, often promised mercy, frequently ended in mass executions. Chronicles from the Albigensian Crusade describe hundreds burned alive despite negotiated terms, their ashes mingling with the shattered gates they'd tried so hard to defend. This was warfare stripped of all pretense, where survival depended not on courage, but on enduring more suffering than the enemy believed possible. Behind every fallen fortress stood stories not of tactical genius, but of ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Glittering armor and noble banners might dominate medieval paintings, but the true backbone of any army was the dirt-streaked peasant gripping a pike twice his height. These weren't just hapless conscripts, they were the original force multipliers, turning simple farming tools into weapons that could topple aristocrats. Picture the Battle of Golden Spurs, where Flemish cloth weavers and farmers, armed with little more than iron-tipped poles, slaughtered French knights so thoroughly that the victors collected 700 golden spurs from the dead. The secret wasn't brute strength, it was physics. A dense forest of pikes held at angles transformed peasants into an impassable wall, where charging cavalry would impale themselves like moths to a flame. Even the mighty English longbowmen, celebrated for victories at Crécy and Agincourt, were overwhelmingly yeomen commoners who trained weekly since childhood as part of village militia laws. Their arrows didn't just rain death, they democratized warfare, proving a well-aimed shaft from a farmer's son could punch through a nobleman's breastplate as easily as a butcher's knife through parchment. The uncomfortable truth: elite warriors often owed their survival to these expendable ranks. When knights dismounted to fight on foot, it wasn't chivalry, it was necessity, as only shields locked with peasants' pikes could repel enemy charges. History remembers the lords who led battles, but the real heroes were the unnamed thousands whose calloused hands reshaped the very nature of medieval combat, one thrust at a time. Darkness didn't just bring rest on medieval battlefields, it was a cloak for some of history's most devastating ambushes. While Hollywood loves dramatic daylight clashes, real commanders knew the cover of night could turn disciplined armies into panicked mobs. Take the Battle of Stirling Bridge, a masterclass in psychological warfare. Wallace and Moray didn't charge headlong at the English. They waited until first light, when groggy soldiers were still fumbling with armor straps, their vision blurred by sleep and the foggy Scottish dawn. The result, a slaughter where disorientation proved deadlier than any sword. But this wasn't just a Scottish tactic. Across Europe, night attacks became the great equalizer. Peasant rebellions could outmaneuver professional knights under the veil of darkness, where expensive armor was a liability in the moonless scramble. The Hussites in Bohemia took it further, attaching chains to their wagons to create eerie clattering sounds that made advancing forces think demons lurked in the blackness. For defenders, nighttime was a waking nightmare. Sentries would stare into the void, jumping at every rustling bush, knowing an entire army might be creeping within arm's reach. The true genius of these attacks, they exploited a universal human weakness, our primal fear of the unseen. A soldier might brace against a visible charge, but how do you fight shadows that disappear the moment torchlight flickers their way? These weren't battles, they were carefully orchestrated hauntings where victory went to those who best weaponized the dark. The gleaming armor and triumphant banners of medieval warfare hid a grim truth: victory often came with invisible wounds that never healed. Chroniclers tell of knights who would wake screaming, their hands clawing at phantom sword strokes in the dark, or noble lords who retreated to monasteries, unable to bear the memories of massacres they'd ordered. These weren't just battle fatigue, they were the unmistakable signs of what modern medicine would label post-traumatic stress. Take the account of the Black Prince after Poitiers. His famous victory left him so haunted by the dying screams of French nobles that he reportedly refused to wear his armor again for years. Even the legendary El Cid, immortalized in song for his conquests, allegedly suffered night terrors so severe his wife kept candles burning until dawn. The psychological toll wasn't confined to nobles. Common soldiers left records in village church logs, men who'd returned from campaigns only to startle at the sound of blacksmiths' hammers, their minds still trapped in the cacophony of clashing steel. Some turned to drink or violence, others simply vanished into forests, preferring the company of wolves to human voices that might whisper of past battles. The real tragedy: medieval society had no framework for this suffering. A knight's nightmares were seen as divine punishment rather than trauma, while a peasant's breakdown might be dismissed as demonic possession. Behind every chronicle's glorious battle description lay unspoken stories of warriors who won the field but lost themselves, their victories measured not in territory taken, but in sleepless nights and trembling hands that could never quite wipe away the blood. The liquid courage of medieval battlefields wasn't some whispered secret, it flowed openly from canteens and barrels, a ritual as common as sharpening blades before combat. Soldiers from Scotland to the Holy Land guzzled ale, wine, or even crude spirits not just for celebration, but as a desperate anesthetic against the horrors ahead. The English at Agincourt reportedly shared casks of sour beer before their legendary longbow volleys, while Swiss mercenaries were notorious for demanding wine rations mid-march. But this self-medication came at a brutal cost. Drunkenness could turn a disciplined phalanx into a stumbling mob, like the Burgundian knights who charged in a disorganized frenzy at Grandson after overindulging, only to be cut down by sober Swiss pikemen. The line between bravery and recklessness blurred with every sip. Some accounts describe archers too inebriated to nock arrows properly, or siege engineers miscalculating catapult tensions with disastrous results. Commanders walked a fine line. Too much alcohol and their army became ungovernable. Too little, and morale might crumble before the first trumpet blast. The cruel irony: that same liquid numbing their fear also dehydrated them under scorching armor, turning the aftermath of battle into a throbbing nightmare of headaches and cramping muscles. For every soldier who fought better with a buzz, there were 10 whose last mistake was believing the bottle made them invincible. Even in the chaos of medieval warfare, there were attempts to impose order, though the reality rarely matched the ideals. The peace of God, proclaimed by church councils in the 10th century, promised divine wrath against those who harmed clergy, peasants, or merchants. On parchment, it sounded noble. On the battlefield, it was more suggestion than law. Monasteries still burned, and crops were still torched, just with half-hearted apologies to local bishops afterward. The true hypocrisy lay in ransom culture, where capturing a wealthy knight could set a soldier up for life, while a common footman's fate was often a slit throat in the mud. Records from the 100 Years' War reveal French lords paying astronomical sums for their release. One duke's ransom equaled England's entire annual tax revenue, while the nameless archers who'd captured him got barely enough coins to buy new boots. This wasn't just unfair, it was systemic. Entire manuals existed on noble prisoner etiquette, detailing everything from acceptable bedroom furnishings for captive knights to the exact percentage of their lands a ransom could demand. Meanwhile, peasant families starved when their breadwinners didn't return at all, their bodies left unclaimed in distant fields. The cruel irony: those same, protected non-combatants often suffered most when armies ran low on supplies, their granaries pillaged under the flimsiest excuses. Rules of war, it turned out, weren't about morality, just another way to enforce the brutal truth that in medieval conflict, your life's value was measured by the weight of your purse, not the content of your character. Those cunning medieval tactics weren't just effective in their own time, they became the foundation for modern military doctrine, proving that warfare's best tricks never really go out of style. Take the feigned retreat, a maneuver perfected by Mongol horsemen who'd scatter as if in panic, only to lure pursuers into a deadly ambush. Centuries later, Patton's Third Army used the same principle in World War II, pretending to falter before crushing German forces in the Ardennes. Even scorched earth, the brutal practice of burning crops and poisoning wells to starve enemies, found echoes in Russia's defense against Napoleon and Hitler, where winter and barren landscapes became weapons as lethal as any trebuchet. But the influence runs deeper than just battlefield tricks. Medieval siege warfare, with its patient blockades and psychological torment, directly inspired the trench warfare of World War I, where starving out defenders replaced frontal assaults. And the concept of chivalric ransom, it evolved into today's prisoner exchanges and diplomatic bargaining, though thankfully without the exorbitant price tags. The irony is stark. An era dismissed as backward by Enlightenment thinkers actually birthed strategies so timeless that special forces still study them. From the use of misinformation to the importance of supply lines, medieval commanders were writing the playbook modern generals still consult, proving that when it comes to war, the past isn't just history. It's a masterclass. The medieval world wasn't a patchwork of isolated battles. It was a sprawling chessboard where moves in one corner sent shockwaves across oceans. When Crusaders marched into the Holy Land, they didn't just carry crosses. They brought back game-changing ideas from Arab engineers, like trapezoidal castle designs that rendered European forts obsolete overnight. Meanwhile, the Mongols' lightning-fast horse archery tactics, honed on the steppes of Asia, sent terrified refugees fleeing westward, spreading knowledge of composite bows and feigned retreats that would later reshape battles from Poland to Hungary. This wasn't just cultural exchange, it was an arms race on a planetary scale. Chinese gunpowder, perfected for fireworks, reached Europe via Silk Road traders and became the backbone of cannons that could topple walls which had stood for centuries. Even seemingly minor innovations crossed continents with devastating effect. The humble stirrup, likely introduced to Europe by Avars or Byzantines, transformed cavalry from skirmishers into shock troops capable of shattering infantry lines, a revolution that birthed the knightly class itself. The lesson: no empire waged war in a vacuum. A samurai's curved blade in Japan influenced the scimitar designs of Persian warriors, while Norse longship techniques resurfaced in Mediterranean galley warfare. Every clash, whether on frozen Russian plains or sun-baked Egyptian deserts, became a deadly workshop where the winning strategies of one culture became the survival lessons of another. Far from being parochial conflicts, medieval battles were the original global network where a tactical breakthrough in Baghdad could echo through battlefields in Burgundy a generation later. Few battle plans in the Middle Ages were scribbled without first consulting the stars, because war wasn't just fought on fields but in the swirling patterns of celestial omens. When Richard the Lionheart's crusading fleet set sail for the Holy Land, his entire campaign stalled for weeks because a priest spotted a raven flying left, an ill-fated direction in medieval divination. This wasn't eccentric behavior, it was standard military procedure. Commanders like Emperor Frederick II kept personal astrologers on payroll, delaying sieges until planetary alignments promised victory or rejecting battle plans if Mercury was in retrograde. Even the famously pragmatic Genghis Khan reportedly aborted an invasion after his shamans interpreted a lightning strike as divine disapproval. But the real power of superstition lay in its psychological grip. Before the Battle of Toten, both Yorkist and Lancastrian forces seized on the same solar halo as proof God favored their side, turning a meteorological quirk into a morale booster that reportedly steeled men to fight harder. Some prophecies became self-fulfilling. The Breton knight Bertrand du Guesclin deliberately spread rumors that a long-dead seer had foreseen his victories, making enemies hesitate just long enough for his tactics to work. The irony, while nobles fretted over comets and crow calls, their enemies often exploited these fears. The Ottomans would stage elaborate omens like releasing flocks of doves to predict Christian defeats. Knowing superstition could unravel an army faster than any cavalry charge. In an age where science and magic blurred, even the most hardened warlords understood controlling men's beliefs was half the battle won. Rivers and coastlines were the lifelines of medieval kingdoms, not just for trade but for survival itself. While castles get all the attention in war stories, the real strategic masterstroke often happened far from stone walls, where silent fleets choked off entire cities without firing a single arrow. Take Constantinople, the mighty capital of Byzantium. Its legendary land walls stood unbroken for centuries, but its downfall came when Ottoman ships hauled overland on greased logs, bypassing the Great Chain, blocking the Golden Horn, and cutting off vital grain shipments from the Black Sea. Within weeks, a metropolis that had withstood 29 sieges began starving. This was the brutal math of naval blockades. Why waste soldiers storming ramparts when you could let hunger do the work? The Hanseatic League turned this tactic into an art form, their merchant fleets doubling as weapons by strangling rival ports into economic submission. A single embargo on Norwegian grain imports could collapse an entire kingdom's resistance, as Denmark learned the hard way during the Kalmar War. Even inland, rivers became battlegrounds. During the 100 Years' War, English control of the Seine allowed them to besiege Paris not with catapults, but by intercepting barges of salt and wheat upstream. The lesson echoed across centuries. Food was more powerful than fortifications. Today's military strategists still study these medieval blockades, recognizing that whether it's 14th century Flanders or modern-day conflict zones, controlling supply routes remains the ultimate checkmate. Gunpowder didn't just change medieval warfare, it shattered an entire social order built on steel and stone. Those first crude cannons, more likely to explode than fire straight, spelled doom for castles that had stood unbroken for generations. Take Constantinople's mighty Theodosian walls in 1453. After withstanding 23 sieges over 1,000 years, they crumpled in weeks under the relentless pounding of Ottoman bombards. But the revolution wasn't just in siegecraft. Handheld handguns, ancestors of modern guns, turned peasant militias into potential night killers with weapons that required minimal training compared to a longbow's lifelong mastery. The shockwaves rippled far beyond battlefields. Armorers scrambled to thicken breastplates into grotesque proof marks where bullets would dent but not pierce, until firearms grew powerful enough to render even plate obsolete. Nobles who'd built fortunes on horseback charges now faced foot soldiers wielding metal tubes that could punch through ancestral armor like parchment. The psychological impact was even more devastating. Chronicles describe war horses panicking at gunpowder's sulfurous stench, their refined training useless against this new terror. And castles, their towering walls became liabilities overnight, as flat trajectory cannonballs could now smash through merlons designed to deflect arrows. The true irony, many early gunpowder weapons were laughably unreliable, barrels bursting, misfires outnumbering hits, yet their mere existence forced a complete reimagining of warfare. What began as alchemical curiosity became the great equalizer, proving that in the face of technological upheaval, even the mightiest knight was just one spark away from obsolescence. Hollywood loves to paint medieval armies as perfectly drilled legions moving in unison, but the reality was closer to a bar brawl where half the patrons secretly hated each other. Picture a typical battle formation: French knights jostling with reluctant German mercenaries, Italian crossbowmen muttering about Breton cavalry blocking their line of fire, and Flemish pikemen refusing orders from nobles they considered foreign oppressors. This wasn't just disorganization, it was a powder keg of clashing dialects, rivalries, and competing paymasters. At the Battle of Nicopolis, Hungarian troops charged prematurely because they couldn't understand their French allies' signals, while during the 100 Years' War, English longbowmen often shot into the backs of their own knights who'd advanced too far. The chaos went deeper than miscommunication. Mercenary companies like the infamous White Company in Italy would switch sides mid-campaign if a better offer arrived, sometimes turning their weapons on former comrades without hesitation. Even language barriers created lethal confusion. Chronicles describe Welsh archers being mistaken for enemy skirmishers because their shouted warnings sounded like battle cries to English ears. The romantic idea of a united army under one banner crumbles under the truth. Medieval warfare was a messy coalition of temporary convenience, where the greatest threat often came from the soldier standing next to you. Far from the harmonious war machines of legend, these were forces held together by little more than shared greed and the fragile hope that today's ally wouldn't become tomorrow's backstabber. The final horror of medieval warfare didn't end when the last sword fell. It unfolded in the grim days after battle, where victory often looked indistinguishable from atrocity. Picture a field littered not just with corpses but with scavengers of all kinds, peasants stripping armor from the dead, camp followers pocketing gold teeth, and commanders tallying prisoners not by name but by ransom value. Those too injured or poor to buy freedom faced summary execution. Chronicles describe ditches filling with bodies as efficiently as a butcher's waste pile. But the true devastation spread far beyond the battlefield. Victorious armies practiced chevauchée, a euphemism for systematic annihilation where crops were torched, orchards girdled, and wells poisoned to starve survivors into submission. The 1346 English raid on Keene wasn't just about defeating French forces, it was about erasing an entire region's ability to resist, leaving so many destitute that refugees choked the roads for months. This wasn't random brutality, it was policy. In Scotland, Edward I's harrying of the north left entire valleys barren for decades, a scorched earth lesson so severe that local dialects still carried traces of the trauma centuries later. And the psychological scars ran deeper than charred earth. Survivors wrote of villages where no bells rang for years because every sound of metal on metal sent veterans diving for cover, their minds still trapped in the clangor of war. The chilling truth, many so-called victories were measured not in territory gained, but in how thoroughly a land and its people could be broken. Long after the banners were furled, the real battle for survival began, with hunger, memory, and the slow realization that for the defeated, peace could be crueler than war. Medieval warfare wasn't just a clash of swords and shields. It was a brutal symphony of innovation, deception, and raw survival where every tactic, no matter how bizarre or cruel, could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Those 30 facts peel back the gilded veneer of Hollywood's nightly romances to reveal something far more fascinating. A world where pigs became flamethrowers, hollowed-out corpses delivered plagues, and the weather decided battles as often as bravery. This was an era that defied simplicity, where the greatest generals were often masters of psychology rather than brute strength, and where the rules of war bent like reeds in the wind when desperation set in. Think about the sheer adaptability of medieval minds turning farm tools into weapons, disguising siege towers as supply wagons, weaponizing faith and superstition to unnerve enemies. Every layer we uncover exposes another contradiction. The knight who preached chivalry but slaughtered peasants for profit, the surgeon whose well-meaning treatments killed more than they saved, the mercenary companies that operated like modern corporations trading in blood and gold. These weren't just footnotes, they were the heartbeat of warfare, proving that history's darkest chapters are also its most inventive. So the next time you see a castle on a hill or a suit of armor in a museum, remember, it's not just metal and stone. It's a testament to an age where survival demanded cunning as much as courage, where the line between brilliance and barbarism blurred with every decision. And if these facts shocked you, here's the real question. What else have we gotten wrong about the past? The myths we take for granted about knights, about battles, even about what it meant to be civilized, are ripe for rewriting. Maybe the most thrilling discovery isn't in the history books yet. Dive deeper, challenge the stories you've been told, and if you've stumbled across a medieval fact that left you stunned, share it below, because history isn't just a list of dates and dead kings. It's a mosaic of human ingenuity and frailty, waiting for anyone bold enough to look closer. Who knows, the next revelation might just come from you.